Okay, welcome everyone. Morning, everyone. Thanks for coming so early, and it's the last day and the earliest scheduled, the earliest time. So congratulations for making it all the way here. So very excited to be moderating this discussion today on coordination, comparability, and restructuring. I felt like, I don't know, for those who attended the 3C session yesterday, it really built those kind of the same arc, which was around dealing with diverse creditors. So yesterday we said things around what dispersion in creditors mean, what type of collective action clauses could help in terms of bringing together various creditors. But now we're going to move one step further in terms of what can we do about coordinating creditors. So my name is Adil. I'm a senior program officer. I work at the Gates Foundation based in DC. We partner with HBL, who've been organizing this excellent seminar. Thank you all of you with that. The Gates Foundation is not particularly known for work on public finance and so on, but there is a team which I'm part of. But most of our work is in health and agriculture. So today, we're going to be working on we're discussing issues of coordination and bringing together various creditors. And it's kind of, myself, I used to work at the First Secretariat in the past, and that's kind of what the First Secretariat is at the end of the day. How to connect variety of creditors. But of course, what we all know is that debt restructuring is a strategic game. This is not new. When the first job was created in 1956, it was precisely to solve for that issue. It kind of did the trick for the most part. Some might disagree, but to some degree. But now this consensus is being challenged, as we all see, and that's why it's great to bring all these brains together to discuss how can we take that bit forward. So this has real consequences for countries. I think everyone is aware of that, and everyone is an expert. But it's the challenge is to get the process that is fast enough for countries, that provide the right level of relief, and that provide a right level of equity among creditors. So I think I'll stop here because we have 4 papers, so that's quite a bit to go through today. But just to give a bit the arc of the paper, we show a little bit the order. The first point we're going to delve into is whether debt restructuring are a good idea in the first place, which you might seem obvious, but actually it's not that obvious. The second one is whether coordination, what type of coordination pays off and what kind of strategies exist. And the last one is why we haven't been historically, and this is more of a historical paper, why have we not succeeded in putting together a framework that works for the restructuring when we know it's going to benefit both debtors and creditors. So without further ado, I think I will turn it over to Alexandre Balduino. Yeah, please go ahead. We'll be taking questions at the end because we have 4 papers and I don't think we can start every time. So please hold on to the question, write it down, and let's just keep it.
Usual right.
That's great. You're in the middle. So thanks everyone for coming and very early in the first presentation. So essentially what we're talking about this paper called Sovereign Debt Restructuring and Reduction of Debt-to-GDP Ratio. Essentially, I don't think I need to motivate this too much, especially in this conference, but since 2020, debt-to-GDP ratios have reached new highs. On average, across countries, it was about 100% of world GDP. And it's projected to remain at above pre-pandemic levels for about half the countries in the world. So this actually poses a challenge for policymakers. In an era of high debt, we also have modest growth and tight financial conditions. It's hard to grow out of your debt, and you're accumulating more and more debt. It's also hard to get newer debt because of interest rates are so high. And so in this sort of scenario, we get to this process where fiscal consolidation might actually not be enough to reduce countries' GDP ratios. And in particular for countries that are facing a disruptive level of debt restructuring can be an avenue to relieve a little bit of the stress that these countries are in. But then the question becomes, and it's kind of the first question you ask, so does that restructuring actually reduce the debt ratio? Intuitively, so it might look like an obvious question, but if we go to the economics behind it, debt restructuring is going to impact both debt and GDP. So the reduction in debt is kind of a mechanical one. If you cut face value reduction, for example, debt is obviously coming down. But the point is that restructuring also has impacts on GDP, and there's a lot of work that has been done on the past that shows this, followed by people in this room. So you can think of that restructuring sending a negative signal to markets, so there's an impact on GDP. If you decrease both the numerator and the denominator, the overall impact is not clear. On the policy level, we have this discussion. Usually people fall into one of two categories. You might have heard versions of each of these arguments during the conference. So the first one is that debt restructuring actually affords countries some fiscal space and gives them the opportunity to go in a more fiscally sustainable path. But on the other hand, you might also argue restructuring is really just a bailout, and it's going to create some perverse incentives, including moral hazard, and doesn't really have a persistent decrease in debt ratio. So what we're going to do is test whether this is true in the data or not. We're not the first people to ask the question. There's, as I mentioned, most of the work in the past is being focused on how does restructuring actually impact GDP, because the impact on debt is a little bit mechanical. We're going to just put both together. There are two papers that are closely related to ours by Brian and Trevish, and then by Cheng and co-authors. What we do relative to these papers, actually, let me skip that, and I'll come back to this paper before. The main issues here, or the main challenges to actually answer this question, are first, there's really no comprehensive data set on sovereign debt. There's a lot of work in the past that has put together incredible data sets that we're going to make use of in this paper, but there's nothing that's really comprehensive and really looks at everything at the same time. And the second is endogeneity. So if we just run the regression and try to get a treatment effect, for example, for restructurings, you might run into issues because countries don't really randomly restructure debt. You might do it in situations where GDP is already lower and so on. And so we're also going to try to address this. And so what this paper does is relative to what's been done in the literature, is exactly try to address both of these challenges. So the first one is that we construct this comprehensive data set building on work that has been done before, and try to control for the selection bias or selection into treatment through an augmented inverse probability weighting estimator, which I'm going to talk about as well in just a bit. Okay, so just keep my time. So for the data, there are two important things here. So the first one, again, it might seem obvious, but the definition of debt restructuring, it can change, and depending on who you ask, it's going to look like different things. The definition that we adopt are, first of all, debt distress events in which, in terms of contractual payments of sovereign debt, are renegotiated. The debt distress part is actually really important. There are cases in which this renegotiation happens, but countries are not classified as being in debt distress. This is mainly going to happen with advanced economies, which I'm not really going to focus on our sample anyway. But in those cases, for example, I'm not going to count as debt restructuring in our definition. And then second, restructuring is correlated with defaults, but they're not the same thing. So a lot of restructuring, actually, the majority of restructuring happens before a country actually misses out on payments on their debt. For our sources, as I mentioned, building on a lot of work that's been done in the past. So we include private external restructuring, official bilateral, and domestic restructuring here. All of these come from either updating or just applying the methodology that other people have passed. Our country level indicators are going to come from the October 22 vintage of the WEO, the World Economic Outlook database from the IMF. And again, we focus on emerging markets and developing economies. So advanced economies here rarely restructure debt, at least in our definition. There are the three cases. I don't remember the three off the top of my head, but the famous one is Greece. So those cases are not going to be included here. Think of this as more of an emerging market thing. And because we consider all restructurings, they're sequential restructurings, they're not only the final time that a country restructures and so on, we end up with about 706 episodes between 1950 and 2021. And our data covers about 115 countries, all of them PMDs. So just to get a preview of what the data looks like, if we look at how restructuring actually happens in the first place, yeah. Most restructuring is going to happen through cash flow relief, so not through face value reduction. About sort of 85% for emerging markets and 3/4 for low income countries. As I mentioned, most restructuring are actually also preemptive, so more than half in each of these cases. And then the credit types, we're going to find a lot of them come from Paris Club or private external. So about half for emerging markets and 3/4 for Paris Club for low income countries. And if you do try to sum up all of these numbers here, you'll find that they all add up for more than 100%. And the reason is because a lot of those cases happen jointly. So they're restructuring with more than one type of creditor at the same. In terms of our methodology, there are sort of two layers on this. So our first layer is we're going to look at this local projection estimator. So essentially what this means is that we regress this change in the debt to GDP. So Y here is a debt to GDP ratio for countries in different horizons. We're looking for 0 to 5 years. We go for 10 and the paper in robustness checks. On a treatment variable, so this is a 0-1 dummy. And it basically tells us that a country has started a restructuring event. The country C has started a restructuring event at year T. This is, it includes both the treatment itself and an interaction with these covariates here. We can also remove the interaction. The results don't really change that much, but this accounts for potential heterogeneity of treatment. And then a bunch of other covariates, which are going to include 2 lags of the treatment dummy. So this is to account for countries that are doing sequential restructuring, so one after the other. Lags of GDP growth and a change in debt ratio. So accounting for trends. And then 1 lag of the change in the foreign exchange rate, inflation, both of which can change the nominal value of debt, and the global output gap, which is there to account for creditor conditions in the rest of the world. I think I'm stuck. Okay, yeah. And yeah, and then the last thing is, the fixed effects here are capturing country and time effects. On top of that, then comes this issue of selection to treatment and endogeneity and so on. And what we do is we use this AFPW, so augmented inverse probability weighted estimator. What this estimator does is just it does the estimation in 2 parts. So in the first stage, we just estimate the probability of the treatment based on X is the same set of covariates that we had before. Here we add interest rates, so US long and short run interest rates, the country's own effective interest rate, debt, the current balance of the GDP, current account of GDP, and the level of the debt ratio. And the reason that this is included here is that countries that have low debt to GDP ratio don't tend to restructure because they're doing fine. But because countries have different debt capacity, debt carrying capacity, this is sort of interactive with the country fixed effect here. And then there's a effect by itself. I'm happy to talk about the results from the first stage, but it does actually classify these episodes relatively well. And once we have these probabilities estimated, the average treatment effect is calculated as this huge equation here. Essentially, this part in the square brackets is just a regular treatment effect. It's just written in terms of the dummies and weighted by these estimated probabilities. The second part here is just accounting for any potential biases or hidden variables that come from the first stage. So from this regression here, this y hat is just the predictive value given treatment or predictive value given non-treatment given controls. So this is going to be consistent under the selection of observables assumption that and this estimator has this kind of good characteristic, which is that it's doubly robust. So if either this model here, our selection model, or this model here, the projection model are correct, then we should be okay. So what do we find? So first thing, if you look at all the debt restructuring episodes, we do find that the average treatment effect is going to be negative. It's statistically significant. These are 95% intervals, but it's significant about that. And it tends to be persistent over time. So 5 years, these are cumulative. So 5 years later, that's GDP is about 7 percentage points lower than it was in the start of the average debt restructuring episode. The issue is not all debt restructuring episodes are created equally. So what can we say about that? So our strategy is to basically repeat the same machinery, the same methodology, and just split our data into different samples. So for example, we keep the control group the same in all estimations, but we want to see if doing restructuring joint with fiscal consolidation, for example, defined as a prime balance, average prime balance being positive, or an average change in prime balance being positive to both. This would mean that we just drop from the treatment group all of the restructuring episodes where this condition here is not met. We do the same thing with face value reduction, looking at all episodes and then looking at only the larger reductions. The point of doing this is that one of the drawbacks of the APW estimator is that our treatment is necessarily 0-1. So there's no sense of larger restructurings doing more than smaller restructurings. So this attempts to get into this and measuring restructuring with face value reduction. And we're calling credit coordination. It's really just the HIPIC and NDRA countries in those samples. So it could be something else, but given everything else that we control for, this is our proxy for coordination among creditors, other countries that are in these programs. Then what we find is it might seem a little bit all over the place. Let's go one by one. See, I'm almost out of time, but the solid blue bars here, these are the same as I've shown it before. The orange bar, these are restructuring events that happen with consolidation. It's interesting to see that on impact, it's not really different from the average restructuring episode, but the difference starts to increase over time because these countries are actually consolidating, and so being able to reduce the debt-to-GDP ratio by not taking debt. And by year 5, the restructuring with fiscal consolidation are the ones that actually reduce debt-to-GDP by most. And so it's not only about the restructuring itself, it's also about the institutions and what countries are doing after the restructuring happened. If we look at face value reduction, so all face value reductions and only the large ones, so we drop the bottom 25% here. On impact, the effect is enormous. So especially for large face value reductions, we get a 70 percentage point drop on that GDP. Interestingly, though, and keep in mind these are cumulative. So after a few years, so by year 4, for example, it's actually comparable to an average restructuring, and by year 5, this might be why people tend to argue, or sometimes argue, that restructuring don't actually work. Some of them actually after some time, the effect here is not statistically significant. So keep in mind the effect's still negative, but the standard errors are huge, and so it's not going to be statistically significant anymore. Although if you do need to reduce your debt to GDP quickly, face value reduction is by far the best way to do that. Again, sounds obvious, but despite the effect on debt, it also has an impact on GDP. You could argue that the countries that do face value reduction are also the ones that are in more dire straits. So the overall impact ex ante is not obvious. And then lastly, countries with credit coordination are in the HIPIC and MDRI programs. The effect on impact for those countries tended to be a little bit higher, partly because these tended to involve face value reduction with a little bit more frequency than the average restructuring. But in those cases, for those programs, by the end, by 5 years, we still have a negative effect, a negative significant. So at least on average, those programs have to do such for countries. Just to conclude, we do find that restructuring has a negative significant, and the important part is long-lasting impact on the GDP, at least the average episode. The effects are largest when they're combined with fiscal consolidation. So again, it's important what countries are doing after they restructure as well. Face value reduction is by far the most effective in the short run. But it's not in the presentation, but I went and I encourage everyone to take a look at the paper. There's a newly updated version online. with a lot more results and lengthy appendices. Cash flow relief can also be an effective way to reduce debt GDP, but it does take a little bit more time. And in fact, when we do the same estimation, the impact on year zero, it tends to be positive, essentially because you're only reducing that present value, you're not reducing face value, but you do impact the GDP. So if you don't change the numerator, you reduce the denominator, the whole thing goes up. But after 5 years, it does have a negative impact. So that's all that I have to say. And I'll take the question at the end. Thank you.
We're gonna have Aitor now. Yeah. Gonna delve deeper into the question of coordination, right?
Very good. Thanks for coming to this presentation. This is your work. Aguirre from University of Navarre, which is sitting there, and Gong Cheng, I think he's watching us through the cameras. Caveats in the introductory slide. So these are our views and the views of the DIS, which is the place where Gong was working when we started with this project, and it's very much work in progress. Okay. So we motivation to see loads of papers trying to discuss the issue that, and I'm gonna try to show what is actually the issue that is proving very hard nowadays to engage creditors into providing relief in a coordinated fashion, no matter that they created the common framework, no matter how many fora they have to discuss, so in the restructurings involving non-traditional official creditors, traditional official creditors, and commercial creditors, or call traditional and non-traditional, they are not forthcoming. And that is despite the fact that in principle, this new framework should be operating using this principle of comparable treatment that was inherited from the Paris Club, and that in principle should be making it easier to move first, because if the relief is delivered in some amounts, then this comparable treatment in principle should imply that other types of creditors should follow suit. Right. So yeah, that's the background, and then what we do. So this is what we are, I mean, not struggling, but we don't really know how to use what we are designing. So let me tell you how we are treating the data. So you are doing the data, and then you can shoot at with it. So, I mean, we want to understand how different creditors go about delivering debt relief, or there are other creditors around that could be delivering relief at the same time. So what we do is we take historical data on the restructurings by different actors. We combine all these the restructurings according to how they happen and who follows who to define this thing that we call the relief case. So literally, we watch the series, we see somebody that is providing the relief. So we are going to call this guy a leader, and we are going to be watching the time series whether somebody in the surroundings is providing another type of creditor, is providing the relief. If that happens, we have a successful leader. If that doesn't happen, we have an unsuccessful leader. At the same time, we can define active and passive followers, right? So if there will be a reaction or not by the creditors in providing relief when one creditor has done it. And if they provide relief, they are followers, they are active. If they do not provide any relief, they are followers, but they don't play again, they stay either. And then, like, once that we combine all these hundreds of debt restructuring events, these less hundreds of debt restructuring events, I mean, we can start trying to answer like a range of questions. So I will hint a little bit at who's restructuring, who's reading, who's following, when they are doing it, how they are doing it, and why are they doing it. Do the conditions for debt restructuring in a game sense depend on who's leading? Do the terms change depending on who's the leader in this provision of debt restructuring in a coordinated manner? Then we also, and this is very terribly preliminary, we have a first go at, I mean, does it pay macroeconomically to coordinate? I mean, we are all the time asking for coordination, but do we know that this really pays? Maybe you get the relief in an uncoordinated manner, you end up in the same place. No real systematic evidence about that, so that could actually be. So then how we do this? So we go to standard sources to find Paris Club, the restructuring data, private sector, the restructuring data, and then the restructuring with the biggest non-traditional official creditor, which is China. And we stopped in 2019 with on purpose because we don't want to contaminate the analysis by anything of the new initiatives. We want to use the past in order to sort of learn about how players played the games before, or interacted before, so that maybe we can get some ideas or notions about what may be going on. Then, as needed, macroeconomic data is coming either from the funds or the work. So then, what do we do with all this time series, right? We have like time series to by countries or the years. 0, 0, 0, 0, event of relief provided. So we have all these time series that are telling us the story, right? So the first thing we do, because this database, they have for all of them, they have debt restructuring events that we call it in a very, very nearby window. First thing we do is bundle them together so that we have homogeneous episodes within types of creditors. We do that using a mechanical rule of 18 months. We break with 24 and change minimally what we see. And this is something that is extensively done in the literature. So, and then how do we aggregate these different events into episodes? We weight we add volumes, and then like other characteristics we weight them by the volume of debt involved that refers to LTVs and refers to amount of principal that is forgotten or written down. Right? So if there are different LTVs across different events composing an episode, then we weight those characteristics by the volumes of it. And then once that we have this narrower set of episodes, then we start bundling the episodes into the game, right? So we are tracking the series, we see someone providing the relief, so that is the beginning of a potential game. So we mark that as a leader, and then we ask what are other creditors doing in a very close time window. Very close, we are out for 2 years. And in those 2 years, we see that the other creditors are doing. We use this slide to simplify how we are bundling the information coming from the series. So here you see, I mean, like this represents 6 events in these different data sets. And we just squeeze that into 3 different games. Right? So samples. Here we have one of these situations in which, in order to set up an episode, we need to combine very close events of restructuring by the Paris Club. Then, because after this episode, within the 24-month window, we have the private sector offering some debt relief. So this is an example of a game. You have the Paris Club leading, and it's successfully leading because the private sector is actively following. This is another example in which the Paris Club is a leader, but the followers don't show up, right? So they are passive. Last one, this is another example of a game that is successful. This one, the leader is China. And in a short window, we have a successful, and we have a minimum follower, somebody that delivers something, in this case, the private sector. So 1 game, 2, 3 games out of 6 events. Good. So, I mean, once that we compress the information that way, I mean, how things look, what do we have? We posted, or we shared here for the conference a version of the paper with tons of tables and graphs, and so like, I mean, there is so much that you can look at that we are kind of struggling. So, I mean, you have many more things. I mean, this is just to exemplify one way, because you can start looking at things, no? And here, I mean, this graph is about understanding what kind of role the Paris Club has been playing, when it has been leading, when it has been a follower, who were the followers when it was leading, if there was any. And it's kind of nice because there is an heterogeneity, very natural. At the beginning, it was the only player in town, so no cooperation whatsoever. Then you start to have the private sector, first as a follower, then maybe a leader. Then you start having China, and you will have some games in which everybody is playing together and contributing there. One way to get a visual sense of, I mean, at least in this very mechanical way, and I understand it's very mechanical, and you will have millions of problems with that, but still, I mean, kind of bundles together, things that happen in close windows of time, and we can give it a name that I think has some meaning and maybe allows for some discussions. So big numbers of how we are compressing the data. So you see, I mean, Paris Club, I mean, like, because there are so many of these events, and I mean, HIPIC, for example, implied 2 or 3 Paris Club programs, all these things bundled very naturally, and with 20, almost 20% of the episodes of the events vanish when we think about episodes. Something similar happens for the other creditors, and then when we combine the episode, again, we get a reduction of 50%, 12% of ones. And then, like, here we are offering some very preliminary, very basic statistics about, I mean, how different creditors have been playing the game, and how often they have been involved in the game in the earlier period where China was not present. So we are all the time breaking down the sample into an earlier period where there was only 2 players in town, Western creditors, official and private, and the later period in which China has been emerging. Ideally, going forward, we may further chunk that thing, is like in 2010 or so, really, like the presence of China was really very tiny in most countries. Anyway. So I have 2 minutes. So more graphs, I already discussed. One thing that we can do is, we can look at the terms offered by different creditors in these restructuring games, right? And what we see is that, I mean, there is a strong emulation for the debt perimeter between the Paris Club and the private sector if the club leads. So there is a positive correlation, right? The Paris Club leads, the quantities involved are positively correlated. Instead, if the private sector leads, this correlation is negative, or at least insignificant, right? So that is telling some asymmetry there about the relation between these guys playing the game. If one looks at principal haircuts, the use of nominal debt reductions, then we see, and this is sort of this news in the later period, there is a lot of coordination on this. There's a lot of coordination, and I think that's very good news because we know that nominal haircuts are very effective. They have a long-run cost, in the short run, they are incredibly effective. So then one thing that we are trying to do is see what is the effect of coordination macroeconomically. So very simple, this would be something like just like the 4th step in a local projection, and we compare coordinated derivative with a coordinated derivative just using dummies. Here are the effects. So, I mean, ideally, I would have loved to show here very strong effects, so we show coordination. But I mean, this is very preliminary, so it was maybe when we really clean and have like some solid regression that will show what shows immediately and very easily is that, of course, the restructuring is a good at denting debt in the medium run, but coordinated debt restructuring is doing more and more clear, right? Because the error bands are small. And then, and this is what we are scratching our heads these days and thinking how we do this, how we present it, what are the right measures. So this comes back to your introduction about the fact that, I mean, like, the creditors are playing game, it's a strategic game. But then it turns out, no, because if a creditor provides relief, it's helping the debtor, that is for sure. But it's actually helping the other creditor, right? It's reducing how much I will need to contribute, and by directly reducing the liabilities of the debtor, is increasing the probability of repayment for others, even if in the future. So there is an aspect of cooperation here that allows to think about these games as cooperative games. And it's kind of cool because there is this, and this was an idea from a colleague back in Pamplona, or will be thankful because she's making me think so much. But it's this thing called the Shapley Valley. I didn't even remember the thing, no? But I mean, like, Mr. got the Nobel Prize for this. So it's a way in which you can measure the contribution of each of the players to a cooperative outcome in a cooperation game. And they tend to be calculated for this game we have here. Is very simple. So you only need to know how likely it is that each creditor is going to be acting as a leader or as a follower. What is the probability that you're going to see these guys doing something? And how much are they going to do when they do? Simple. Shapley value is simply the probability that I will lead and the expected value of the relief I will provide, plus the probability that I will follow, plus the relief that I will provide if I follow. So we can compute this from our days because for each game we have payoffs. Because the game is played many times and we see many different outcomes, we can compute different probabilities of the players playing different roles. There are many ways to calculate the payoffs. Today, maybe to be provocative, we are going to just be using the proportion of all the debt restructured in each game. Okay, this delinks the measure from the volume of debt. Okay, which plays in the favor of life. So, okay, from our games, we get all the numbers that we need to calculate Shapley values. And maybe focusing on the later period, what we see is that the most likely leader is China. The least likely leader is the private sector. When a player leads, it does a very large contribution to the overall debt that is restructured. Now, if they follow what? If they follow, look, private sector does not follow. And those that follow most, again, the Chinese. And if you look at what they contribute when they follow, and they are so cheap, right? Everybody, but particularly our private sector friends. Okay, so with all those numbers, we go and calculate Shapley values. And these are the Shapley values that one would want to consider to think about what may be going on today. And if you look at those numbers, and if you think about the number that we just discussed that build these numbers, it comes as very natural that nobody goes first. And if nobody goes first, there is no relief being provided in this game, right? Yeah. So we know that other metrics like volumes or volumes to GDP would provide different measures, they would dwarf the contribution of China. But I think that this actually reflects the different arguments that are being put on the table in a kind of simple mathematical manner. Just are the main takeaways, and I stop because I think I took a little bit.
So much. Now we're gonna turn over to Sayantan, who's online. Can you hear us, Sayantan?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes. Thank you.
Wonderful. We can hear you well. You should go ahead.
Mr. Sayantan.
Excellent. Do I have space to upload my slides, or will that be? Is that already
No,
done?
you can hear us. We have already done that. Just 1 second. We're projecting it.
Okay.
Yeah. Is it visible?
Yeah, that's visible. Thank you so much. Thank you. So let me just begin by thanking the organizing committee for inviting me, and also for being considerate enough to allow me to speak remotely, given some personal circumstances for which I couldn't personally be present there. So this is very much, so could turn to the next slide, please. So this is, so I'm going to summarize the paper essentially in one slide. So as many other speakers have already spoken, have already pointed out, debt restructuring typically involves delay. And what I'm interested in this paper is to understand the theoretical reasons as to why delay may be associated with brinkmanship. And by that, I mean the idea that, you have either the creditor or the debtor holding out to a certain point in time and then suddenly capitulating. And, so the RUFO clause, law clause used by Argentina is an example. Greek debt restructuring is an example. Latin American debt restructuring is also another example, where it was the creditor that essentially conceded very rapidly. Or you could have a situation with gradual concessions. So by that, I mean that there is a kind of orderly debt restructuring process. In every round, people keep, the debtor or the creditor keep making concessions, and so on. And gradually, the issue of debt restructuring gets resolved over time. And for particular real world examples, I think Ghana and Zambia in the recent debt restructuring episodes are instances of that. So what I'm interested in this paper is to understand the rationale for either of these two or both the two bargaining strategies. And the way I approach it in this paper is to essentially look at a two-sided incomplete information bargaining model in continuous time. And I want to establish the conditions under which brinkmanship or alternatively gradual concessions emerge as bargaining proceeds. And then, because I'm working with it in continuous time, I can actually calibrate some of the quantify the effects of the different types of bargaining strategies on the nature of concessions and the expected length of delay in both these scenarios. Why is this an interesting question as against a theoretical curiosity? The reason why it is interesting is because, in some sense, one of the two, at least two of the issues that people mention, various policymakers, including the UN General Assembly, etc., have mentioned as being key issues in debt restructuring is good faith and transparency. And by good faith, the idea is that it's an obligation for debtors and creditors to bargain with each other. And transparency is basically the idea that, sources of any potential source of incomplete information can be resolved by revealing that information in a credible fashion to all parties involved. And essentially, what this paper shows, and both these are typically taken to be good things in terms of reducing the delay that is associated with debt restructuring, making the debt restructuring process more orderly. And as I will show in this paper, that actually neither good faith nor transparency on their own reduces delay. But in a sense, good faith is associated with gradual concessions. And in the absence of good faith, what you see that brinkmanship emerges. And then I have a short policy discussion about the implications of that. And then there is a vast related literature which looks at essentially games, bargaining games or debt restructuring games with incomplete information, but they typically tend to be one-sided incomplete information. But brinkmanship doesn't make sense if you don't have if you have if you don't have double-sided incomplete information, and they tend to think of debt restructuring in terms of finite, in terms of discrete time. And the reason this is a problem is because typically delay means 1 period or 2 period delay, so you cannot really calibrate the length of delay if you don't work in continuous time. So essentially, this paper makes a departure from the standard literature on incomplete information and delay by looking at essentially complete two-sided complete incomplete information and a continuous time. So the next slide, please. So the basic bargaining scenario is that you have a single, I'm going to abstract from all issues of data coordination for the purposes of understanding the use of brinkmanship and gradual concessions. We can always add data coordination issues at a later step, but I don't think that's essential to the story. So from a theoretical point of view, it makes sense to abstract away from all inessential complications. So I'm going to assume that we have a single debtor and a single representative creditor. There's going to be a common discount rate with an associated discount factor, that is the exponential discounting function, which is just e to the power minus delta. And then you have the length of time over which is basically the gap between two successive rounds of debt restructuring. I'm going to assume time is continuous. So essentially, for the purposes of this presentation, and also in the paper that was circulated in the main body of the paper, all results are reported as delta t tends to 0. The bargaining surplus is normalized to 1, and essentially the interpretation is that the surplus is the face value of the debt to be restructured, with the fraction retained by the solvent debtor indicating the write-down involved in debt restructuring. I'm going to assume that there is two-sided incomplete information. So basically the incomplete information here is about outside options that the debtor and the creditor have if bargaining breaks down. And I'm going to make certain very simple assumptions on these, on the values of these outside options, which essentially mean that, which have the implication that it is common knowledge, even at the interim and at the ex ante stage, that efficiency requires immediate settlement. So basically, the efficient benchmark is always going to be immediate settlement. And so in a sense, the length of delay is a marker of inefficiency of the debt restructuring process. And then the working assumption here is that the incomplete information aspect of it is basically that debtors really, that both the debtor and the creditor have some common prior. But essentially, what this common prior does is that it rules out a situation where both the debtor and the creditor have high values of the outside option. Okay, so either both of them have low values, or one has a high value, the other has a low value. And it is exactly this feature that enables me to say that efficiency requires both ex ante and interim. Efficiency requires immediate settlement. So before bargaining begins, each player observes that their own value of the outside option, but not of the other player. So in a sense, conditional on your own information with probability half, the other player can have a high or a low outside option. And the identity of the person making the offer on the person responding doesn't matter. What is important here is that whoever is chosen to make the offer continues to make the offer through the duration of the bargaining game, and vice versa. But for simplicity of exposition, I'm going to assume that it is the debtor who makes the offer. Could you have the next slide, please? So basically, what is brinkmanship? So brinkmanship essentially is the idea that, so the simplest way to model it is to say that both the debtor and the creditor have to show up in a common venue to bargain with each other. Okay. And if the other player doesn't show up in this common venue, then no offer can be made. Okay. If both players show up, then it is the debtor who makes the offer. Okay. And if there is no show or the current offer is rejected, the whole process is essentially iterated till an agreement is reached. And then once an agreement has been reached, the debtor and the creditor exit with a payment that's equal to the settlement offer and focuses on the perfect Bayesian equilibrium of the bargaining game. And as I've already said, essentially, all results that I'm going to report here are as the interval between different bargaining rounds tends to 0. I'm not going to, I mean, a key point here is that at any perfect Bayesian equilibrium, there must be delay. I show this in the paper, but I'm not going to repeat the proof here. But that's an important essential step, because essentially the issue with delay here is not so much that there is an equilibrium without delay and an equilibrium with delay. It just, so that would be a coordination problem essentially, and that can be resolved through many different mechanisms. Here, there is something essential to the bargaining game that implies that you have delay. Could I get the next slide, please? Sorry. Yes. So, I mean, you can skip the details of this slide. But fundamentally, what is going on here is that conditional on the debtor's type. So if the debtor has a high value, then the debtor essentially attaches a probability 1 to the creditor having a low value outside option. Both the debtor and the creditor know this, so the debtor offers a low value and basically a low offer which matches the outside option, and the creditor immediately accepts and both players exit. On the other hand, if the debtor has a low value, then essentially what happens is that the debtor makes an offer, a low value offer to begin with, and then essentially doesn't show up to bargain with the creditor. Okay. And after a length of period of time, T basically shows up, both the debtor and the creditor show up, and at that point, the debtor makes a high value offer. So this is what I mean by the capitulation. So you're absolutely committed to making a low offer to the creditor as a debtor. You maintain that low offer, and you don't show up. So you refuse to bargain with the creditor, and then at some period of time, you suddenly capitulate and you make a higher offer to the creditor. So this is observed that this is in terms of pure strategies, and also observe that this is not possible if the no-show option is not an option. Because the way these strategies implemented is by saying that, look, I make you an initial offer and then I'm not going to bargain with you till a certain period of time. And it's only at that point of time will I revise my offer. So this is very similar to the lock laws that Argentina followed in its own debt restructuring process. It is in practice, this is implemented by something called the Rufo clause, which all of you are familiar with. In the Greek debt restructuring, again, this was the intransigence of the Greek government not agreeing to what the Troika were doing. And again, in the context of the Latin American debt restructuring in the 1980s, this is essentially the banks just refusing to restructure Latin American debt for a very long period of time. Now, how do we characterize the length of this? So in a second-base scenario, what we need is we have two incentive constraints from the creditor's side. The first one is essentially saying that the creditor with a low outside option shouldn't want to pretend to be the creditor with the high outside option, and vice versa. And these two incentive constraints pin down the length of time, the length of the delay. And what is interesting, and as a consistency, it is interesting that when the value of the two outside options tend to 1, so in some sense, when the incomplete information disappears, then there is immediate agreement. Essentially here, it is the debtor with a low outside option. We interpret this debtor's equilibrium behavior as brinkmanship. The idea is that you're intransigent, you make a low offer, you insist you're not going to change your offer for a very long period of time, and then you suddenly capitulate. Okay, so can I get the next slide, please?
And then we have 2 minutes left. You need to wrap up now.
Okay, sure. So I'm just going to skip this slide then, if you don't mind, and go directly to gradual concessions. So with gradual concessions, the point is that this no-show option is no longer an option. Okay. So this is essentially the imposition of good faith. And the imposition of good faith basically means that in every round, you have to either the debtor has to make an offer. So this is essentially what you could imagine. This is essentially what the New York courts intervened in the Argentinian debt restructuring process by imposing good faith restrictions on the debtor's behavior. And could I go to the next slide? And essentially, what happens now is that a pure strategy equilibrium doesn't exist. And the strategy of brinkmanship can no longer be an equilibrium, because the strategy of brinkmanship relies very much on the debtor being able to commit, not to bargain. However, observe that if the initial offer made by the debtor is rejected, then the debtor knows with probability 1 that the creditor has a high value outside option. And if in the absence of being able to commit not to bargain, the debtor cannot sustain such a strategy of differentiating between the two creditor types using pure strategies. If an offer has to be made in every round. So the consequence of that is that now we are in a world in which essentially the debtor must have no incentive to deviate. So in other words, the debtor is going to make an offer that keeps the two creditor types indifferent. The two creditor types in turn play a mixed strategy. So basically, they accept or reject the offer with some probability. The debtor then updates his posterior belief over the creditor's type by using a continuous time version of Bayes' rule. And so what we can then calculate as part of the equilibrium is the total probability of acceptance of the debtor of the creditor and how that evolves over time. So basically, initially there is some initial probability of acceptance of either creditor type, and that is going to increase over time. The debtor keeps making an offer which keeps the two creditor types indifferent, the evolution of the strategies are such that basically over time, the creditor with the lower outside option, lower value of the outside option, his probability of acceptance, their probability of acceptance declines over time, and the creditor with the higher value of outside option, their probability of acceptance goes up over time. The length of delay in the coordination in this good faith bargaining scenario with gradual concessions is not going to change from the brinkmanship, because at the end of the day, we still need to have certain incentive constraints to bind. But what is important is that the expected length of delay will fall. So could we then skip to the...
Sayantan, we need to keep it at that. Unfortunately, we need to move to the next speaker so everyone has a time to present.
Right. That's okay. I've conveyed the main message. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Christina?
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here so early. And warm thanks to the organizers for putting all of this together and for the kind invitation. So this is going to come a little bit as a sort of multi-item and now for something completely different for the moment. But it will help bring the debtor's perspective on comparability of treatment and equal handling in restructuring. So I think it will add to our conversation. Is this one work?
Yeah, it should be.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So the main focus of the paper is the sort of long-lasting effort to build a sort of institutional mechanism to resolve debt repayment problems, commonly tagged as a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, most famously through its proposal by the IMF. And there's a common origin story about why we do not have one. So lack of political appetite is the predominant, explanation. But the origin story of where this came about, where this idea came from, is traditionally sort of taken back to post-Argentina as default, the proposal by the acting deputy managing director for an SDRM that was famously jettisoned by the US, and that sort of killed that proposal. And we're very familiar with the story after that. Looking further back, we are sometimes taken to this speech by Jeffrey Sachs in post-Mexico, so large capital account crisis in the mid-90s, and this desire to sort of actually bring bankruptcy procedures to the sovereign level through the adoption of US bankruptcy codes applied to the sovereign. And even further back, this desire to have an SDRM is sometimes traced to the work of the UN and the group of 77 countries proposals in light of UNCTAD negotiations. So this is picking up from a point by Rogoff and Zettelmeier, who sort of pinpoint the initial starting point of this desire for an institutional mechanism to this point. So this paper really takes that as a motivating point to try to recreate this debate about the desire to have this institutional mechanism, what it would be useful for, by basically presenting a historical account, a historical paper to just piece together the episodes through the light of not opposite the UNCTAD negotiations. So it's archival work based on the UN archives in New York, Geneva, and Geneva has many archives, UNCTAD and general UN archives. Looking at the first UNCTAD conference from 1964, that was sort of presided over by Raoul Prebisch, and had these great hopes for developing countries to sort of actually negotiate financial, monetary, international issues on an equal footing with advanced economies to the eve of the debt crisis. So I sort of use that as my cut-off point because I think it's important. We sort of start a lot of the conversations with 1982. And in fact, it's important to recall that actually there was a very vibrant debate of what was happening up until the eve of the debt crisis. So while that is a monumental moment, a lot of the problems with creditor coordination and sort of precedent had already been set far before that. So the paper focuses on the statements of the delegates, the voting patterns, the resolutions that were proposed at each negotiation, including the sort of preparatory materials and the material in the negotiations themselves. So I won't take, I won't go through all of them, but I do want to highlight a few sort of summary points. The first point is that there were numerous opportunities to establish a number of better frameworks, guidelines, or machinery to deal with sovereign debt repayment problems. Forums through which debtors and creditors were negotiating directly, and a number of missed opportunities. So we have a number of different events that we've looked at, that I've looked at, and the different proposals that were discussed. Most of them are refinancing options. So how to deal with really punitive financial terms of financial assistance and the different proposals for how those can be reprofiled and rescheduled. So specific proposals about the sorts of transformation that would facilitate better repayment prospects in the future, and the response by the creditor countries. So predominantly, all of the proposals are vetoed or against by the main kind of creditor club group of countries. The other thing to note is as time goes on, you kind of get this entrenchment of divided camps with hardening approaches on either terms, partly because the number of countries facing repayment difficulties is escalating. So the terms of financing is hardening. So the terms of new financial assistance is hardening. Some of the debt restructurings in the 70s are extremely punitive, precisely to sort of set any kind of lenient precedents for other countries. And this creates an escalation on the demands of the debtor countries as well. So initially the demands are for better terms, but over time it becomes actually, no, we need to define common agreement, common restructuring rules and guidelines, and to sort of finalize with actually an institutional mechanism posted within the UN to do this coordination effectively and properly. So there's more on that in the paper itself, but I want to also the point I want to highlight that one of the aspects of the debate that's really crucial, and it's crucial right from the start, is what I've usually called the form of economic analysis. So what would be the corresponding economic analysis that would be suitable for debtors and creditors to ascertain what is the right form of restructuring, what are the right terms of restructuring. So basically there's an understanding on both sides that we don't understand, we need to invest further in the way that we understand the debt repayment prospect, the development process overall, but there's no agreement on what that should look like. And I'm just sort of signaling this as a precursor to these to the sort of current framework for assessing debt sustainability and the desire to reform it into something better. So just a point that there's always been a power over how repayment prospects are defined, over which there was great contestation over how to do that. So debtor countries are predominantly focused on, we need an economic analysis that's going to focus on our long-term development. Okay, it's going to set socioeconomic goals, not just a quick return of creditworthiness, where we just have restructuring after restructuring because the relief isn't deep enough. The cause of debt restructuring, rather than, let's say, what the IMF looks at, should look at international factors, the policies of other countries as being sort of instigating some of our own problems, as well as domestic problems that lead to debt repayment problems. And what we want from an analysis is a scenario analysis that will look at the different forms of financing and restructuring possibilities to lead to the quickest return to growth. Okay, so this idea that the larger the nominal haircut, the smaller the primary balance adjustment that will need to happen. So if you have no nominal haircuts, the adjustment has to be large to take up the slack. And in fact, who does the economic analysis and how? So the independence of debt sustainability analysis being crucial right from the start. So we need to have an institutional mechanism that we can all agree on how our repayment prospects are going to be assessed. So the creditor's view is actually to say, from the very beginning, something completely different. First of all, there is no generalized debt relief problem. There is no generalized debt crisis. We just have some isolated instances, in which case there's no reason to have a general framework, right? So we can just deal with things on a case by case because there's no general problem. These problematic cases here and there, although they're mounting annually, frequently, are exceptional, and effectively you can deal with them like the IMF does as a short-run balance payment problem. It's not a developmental problem, it's a short-run balance payment problem. And so the only time when restructuring is actually justified in that framework is when the case of imminent default. So when the adjustment program is not sufficient to deal with that. So that's the only time that a restructuring is sort of called for. And always in this case by case short term through creditor club. And there's often this well, there's repeated demand that the claims of bilateral and private creditors are dealt completely separately. So I just want to go through this is a big bifurcation of the debate, how it develops over 15 years. To just focus on, again, there's a forum which brings both creditors and debtors together this is in 1977 and 78, in order to define what an operational, what would be the guidelines that we would need to, what would be the questions that we would need to agree on in order to have some sort of operational framework that we would, that we could both agree to. These are the sets of questions that are laid out. The sort of agreement that we need to happen with how a debt procedure is instigated, how a party is committed, what are the goals of the negotiation in the first place. If restoring the agreed development path was the goal, the guidelines should stipulate concrete quantitative measures. So it could be that we want and return to growth in so many years of time. What were the duties? What should be the duties and rights of creditors and debtors? And how could a balanced institutional framework be created to ensure that the discussion and analysis was not prejudicial to any participant? Of course, there's no agreement, and this is just what's put on the table. So this is not to say that any progress was made in this regard, but it's just to say that basically on the eve of the debt crisis, on the eve of the 1982 crisis, there's already a complete divergence and diagnosis of the problem. The creditors and debtors are already seeing what's happening from two very different standpoints. The form of economic analysis that would be relevant to resolve debt crises is sort of derivative of the form of debt restructuring that we have. So I'll leave it at that because I know we've already gone. You can read this in more detail because it's loaded online. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for the excellent presentation. We have thankfully a little bit of time left now for conversation. I think there's quite a few teams. So I want to capture everything because I'm waiting for the text closely. I see there's already some hands up. So maybe Theo?
I have a question for Alexandre to start with. Have you thought about checking the impact of restructuring that are conducted in or out of the payment program? It might have weird effects on, for example, the size of the territory reduction through the use of the MMPSA, the consolidation as well. And it's a question today where the role of the MF in restructuring, maybe you've thought about it. And for Aitor, how would your research evolve in today's world where you have one group of creditors that prevents the other one from going first? And what we've seen, for example, in Zambia, where because you don't have a full clarity on what the comparability targets are going to be, the private sector has been prevented to move basically for 3 years. How it will impact your research going forward.
I'm going to take another set of questions. Please go ahead. You and then we'll pause for now and then we'll go for another round. Please go ahead.
For Alexandre, my question is on, I think you focused on context where you had the restructuring to deal with stock reductions, but how does your model have implications for when restructuring happen primarily for a flow bunch up or a flow consideration as opposed to a stock consideration? And secondly, on how exactly the implications happen for context where inflation can affect nominal growth prospects. So you mentioned inflation in the model, just want to get your idea on how you consider inflation affecting nominal growth prospects and how that can tie into the fact that when you have a larger face value haircut, you're probably in a context of higher debt distress, probably in a context of higher valuation pressure. So how that balance kind of happens?
Please go ahead, last question, and then we get another round of words.
Thanks so much for these presentations. Thanks so much. First one, Mishra, Aitor, maybe following on. You can use the time series of your data to think about changes in the regime that might change the behavior, strategic behavior. Thinking about the IMS lending and cyber arrears, the emergence of collective action clauses, like how does that change the behavior of coordination within these groups that then impacts coordination across the groups, lumping together creditors within those factors? And then for Christina, I was wondering whether you can tell us a little bit more about what the proposals were for the institutional structure for an independent DSA, and how you think that, what lessons there might be in those for contemporary discussions about potential reforms.
Alexandre, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. So for the first question, so we don't have any results separating the IMF restructurings and non-IMF restructurings. In principle, we could do that. There is one issue, which is that most restructurings are going to involve IMF restructuring, especially when they're talking about EMDs. I think all the Paris Club restructurings sort of require an IMF program that goes along with them. So it would essentially be only private external thing. But yeah, it's something that we could do. Otherwise, you can also think of the HIPIC and DRI as kind of a proxy for this, because those all involve IMF programs as well. And on the second question on the cash flow relief. So yes, we do this in a model. This was kind of, I didn't have time to put in the presentation, so I added as a last bullet, like kind of a trust me thing. It is on the paper as well. Part of the issue is that cash flow relief only reduces the net present value of debt. It doesn't really reduce face value. And when you compute that GDP, we look at face value over GDP. So what we end up finding is that cash flow relief only reduces as GDP after like 3 years, passes the restructuring event. But it can be a significant reduction as well. From I think it was like a 5 percentage point, something like that, but only after 5 years. And on the inflation part, so yeah, we have inflation included in the model as well, and we have real GDP growth. So like effects of nominal growth should be accounted for. But I think you do have a point in that, like the restructurings that do have face value reduction, especially the large ones, are also probably the countries that are in like deep trouble. And so this might also explain a little bit why you have this massive impact in that beginning, but then the impact on the GDP sort of weighs out and becomes not significant after a few years. It could be because these countries were already much worse than the average country doing.
Thank you.
So Theo, sorry, maybe we can talk more later, no? But if I got you, like you are concerned about the fact that the official creditors have thrown back a deal by the private sector.
How that the private sector didn't have from the start all the parameters when the DSA was published. The private creditors couldn't start going first and doing a deal. Philip might have a slightly different view because they didn't have the comparability parameters that would fully be revealed later. So they could have done a ballpark thing, but if they wanted to be maximalistic in their approach, they couldn't move to no sense.
So I get that. I mean, I have to recycle what I find there in order to bring something to this one. So we have this notion that if you leave the private sector for the second play, they do it so that they don't contribute. They find them. I don't know how they do it, but when you look, even in the earlier period, the proportional contribution to the games is always significantly smaller for the private sector, not even once. So if you are somehow forcing the private sector to go last, but then you have another creditor there, let's call it China, that kind of can see that this other creditor, when it goes last, is really doing at least as possible, then that other creditor may not want to move first, and then maybe you're stuck. I may be able to say that from the numbers I see there. Then I may have my other opinion, what's the role of the MFDSA, so on and so forth. But from these numbers, I'm thinking of the kind of strategy that they see to the peak. If you place a recalcitrant relief provider like the private sector last, I mean, the odds are that the one moving first is going to contribute more, therefore maybe the one moving first is yes. Super well taken, absolutely. We should explore this thing. Probably some of them, they show some change in behaviors.
Yeah. A good idea. I don't know if I can throw a question given that
We're going to take another round. Yes, Christina?
Yes, thank you for your question. So there was no precise template, but it was more about outlining the sets of relevant considerations. And the main things that are on the table are the, rather than a sort of quick return to creditworthiness view, we need to take into account long-term developmental prospects and shine the light away from just it being a domestic sort of management problem and looking at international causes of debt repayment problems. So bringing in more factors into consideration, and the fact that there is strong disagreement with the IMF's calculation. So the idea that there has to be an independent body that's doing this sort of at least by common agreement on how repayment prospects are ascertained.
Or some other questions?
Yes, so I have one question for Aitor. So is there any data you could use to look at sub-cases within these broader like creditor classes, for example, within private creditors where you have banks or bondholders moving first or following one the other, and maybe even within the broader China denominator where you have different agencies that may also have to coordinate. So that would be maybe not for the whole sample, but in cases that would be interesting. And then also a question for Christina. So did you find any heterogeneity in the views within the debtor community about like proposals going forward? Because if I remember well, the SDRM was also objected to by Mexico, for example, and also Mexico, I think, objected to the latest round of UN principles for so do you find any disagreement within that?
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, this would follow up on that question, whether you, with emerging creditors, you saw any changes in the.
Yeah, my question was to Alexandre. On that result, that restructurings are most effective when accompanied by fiscal consolidation. So I wonder if you could sort of break that down to, what type of fiscal consolidation, because you can go the easy way and sort of cut capital spending, or the hard way, remove subsidies and so on. And then second part of the question will be, which channel that goes through. Is that just because the primary balance is affected, or is that through the
Christina, thanks very much for your presentation, which connects up with my life story. Because I was recruited by the OECD in 1980 to lead the analytical work of something called the Group on North-South Economic Issues. And that group was formed because there was a real apprehension that there would be UN global negotiations in which a debt system would be established. But looking back on your 15 years, just a couple of points. First of all, the Development Assistance Committee in 1964 wrote quite a big report on debt because there'd been Indian problems and so forth. And the conclusion of that report was that grants were needed as development finance in this first period. But one other thing that was happening in that period was in the export credit community, when an export credit community was formed in the OECD, and their objective was to stop the excessive competition between export credit agencies and get harder terms. And I wondered if you brought the export credit community into your analysis, because then after 1982, there was an emphasis on getting consolidated debt data, and we were doing that in the OECD through the creditor reporting system, which was deal by deal account, and working with the debtor reporting system. And we had an international debt working group, and we were supplying data to the Paris Club. So the Paris Club was the story, the continuing story, and now we are where we are, which finally we may be getting some kind of group. And there, the data is coming from basically the World Bank data reporting system. And as I understand it, the World Bank is trying to build up this reporting system, bringing creditor data in as well, especially from China. So that that there would be this database to feed the common framework concern. So it's a great story. Thanks, Christina.
Thank you very much. So, sorry, we won't be able to take more questions. Maybe be very briefly because I think we'll need to leave pretty soon from the speakers. You want to start, Adil?
Sure. So the answer from mine is quick. No, we don't really go into the channel. We define the principal consolidation as primary based on primary balance. Of course, it does affect GDP, fiscal multipliers, and so on, but we don't really delve into these channels in this paper. It's an important question, but it's a little bit outside of it.
Absolutely, Dennis. I think that this way of considering how to combine actions that should be taken together. I mean, it's not that you can only apply to showing the restructurings, potentially you can apply it to the implementation of the legal policies. So, super, I mean, that be it.
On the point of heterogeneity, there's both in debtors and creditors' views, so different camps. So in the debtors community, it's like today, the sort of very long haul cases that can't take any more loans that need debt relief now. So what becomes LIC group or HIPIC group countries and others. And in the creditor community, you have sort of Nordic group, which is slightly more compliant with what was meeting, and the sort of more traditional Anglo-Saxon Western countries, which are, that never agree to anything. But the countries that are more willing to sort of agree slightly easier terms are the Nordic things. And just on the fantastic, I'd love to know more. One of the things that's really crucial in the sort of comparability thing, and I think it's very relevant to what you just said, is how the terms of the loans are largely determined, at least until sort of the collapse of the USSR, trying to win over countries in spheres of influence. The geostrategic determination of terms is crucial, and the progressive hardening of terms. So countries are actually faced with very different terms of assistance, and then in restructuring, very different leniency or punitive depending on where you sit. So I think that is kind of fundamental to how the sort of interaction between creditors and debtors is playing out.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think they could be back and forth.